Hi guys, and welcome back to Pass and Move. And for today's episode, well, it's not really a series. We're not playing a Let's Play mode. This isn't a live Liverpool series, so don't worry if you're, watching that series and you think you're gonna get any spoilers. This is actually just my own little personal save. What we're gonna be doing today is actually showing you how to bring in the best players for your club. Now, some people assume this is just going to be an episode of a list of players that you can bring into your club, the best ones around the world, bargain buys, wonder kids, that sort of thing. But that's not my type of thing. I don't enjoy actually. I've never looked at any of those type of lists since I've started playing the game. Not just this version, of course. When the very first time I started playing it. I just think it sucks all the joy out of the game. A lot of the enjoyment of it is actually finding a player that's never been discovered and buying him and improving him and him becoming a top player for you. Those lists sort of ruin the fun out of the game, if you ask me. And so this episode is more about how to bring in the best players for your club by using the scouting system, and what type of players you should be looking for, and how I personally search for players. And how more often than not it works out for me, at least. And so there's a lot of different things that divide people's opinion. I think some people say attributes is the way to go. If you look at attributes, that's definitely, if you have a player who's got top attributes, it's gonna be a top player for you. Some people say no, ignore all of that, just look at ability. If someone's got top ability, they're gonna be a top player for you, and that's it. And then some people, of course, say no, ignore. Don't obviously completely ignore it, but some people say you have to actually look at personality. And if you ask me, it's a bit of all three. Now, the scouting system's been completely revamped in this new FM18. To be honest with you guys, I'm still trying to adjust to it myself. I feel like the scouting focus thing is, I always keep it on general, all scouting range, all this sort of business as you can see here. I've used the short term thing sometimes, occasionally during transfer windows. It does really help if you set like a week. For example, you tell your scout, I want you to find someone within a week, a right back, and I just want them to have a maximum age of 25 or 23, and I want them to be a fullback. That does kind of work if you do have decent scouts. They do find decent players, but of course you have to be, you have to pick the player yourself. This thing does still work, but I feel like the method that I used to use in previous FMs is still the best one. I've sort of just left the scouting responsibility to my chief scout. They've changed the way they do their assignments and whatnot, so I've left that. But in terms of actual scouting, I always obviously set the senior and youth packages to as high as possible. Gives you your most selection range, I suppose, and so it seems to make the most sense. And of course, the scouting budget, whenever possible, I do increase it in its favor. That's kind of just the general things. Of course, the more world knowledge you have, the more available, so try and pick top scouts. I guess I can start with that. The very basis of picking a good scout has everything to do, of course, with their judgment of ability and judgment of potential. But of course, other things that come into consideration are their personality. If they have a balanced personality, there's a very neutral one. Personalities that you do want to look for that are better are possibly, fairly ambitious, fairly professional, fairly determined. Those ones are more positive personalities. And in truth, I try and avoid neutral personalities as much as possible, because I feel like your staff obviously influence your squad, and you want your squad to be completely professional, ambitious and determined type of squad. You don't want anyone who's sort of neutral, not really fired up during games or anything of that sort. So it starts with your scouting system. Judgment, player of ability and potential is what everyone goes for, and the game's added a suggestion that you should look at adaptability. Since your scouts are traveling all over the world, it makes sense that they need to adapt. But I feel like determination is an attribute that people overlook quite often. It's a huge attribute to keep an eye out for, so try and find one. I always, for my staff, try and look for attributes of 12 and above. So if you ask me, Gerardo here, his adaptability is a bit low for my liking, but he kind of makes up for it for his ability and potential, so it kind of makes sense. Normally, you should try and stick to nationalities that are of your the league that you're playing in, so it should technically be England. But when it comes to scouts, you can have a lot of range of nationalities, because you do want to increase your world knowledge as much as possible. When it comes to your chief scout, do keep an eye on your man management. They have to have a high man management, because they need to be able to deal with the fellow staff members well if you are a chief scout. But that's kind of the general basis of the scouting. Now, when it comes to your actual players, because you need to be able to trust your scouting staff when it comes to actual players. So you go onto your players. If you ask me what I like to do, obviously set the transfer on, they have to be interested in actually joining your club. The other thing I like to do is I'm not really a huge fan of investing in anyone above the age of 29. I also try and avoiding players who are of the age of 21 and 29 in truth, because any contract you give them at that stage is kind of not working in your favor, more so in theirs. They're obviously going to get, older and lose their ability and whatnot, so it has to be very particular, specific top buys, players that you can't do without type of thing. But that's just my suggestion. Of course, when you're with the smaller clubs, you do want to, you don't really need to necessarily use up this age suggestion, because sometimes the only players that you can actually invest in are older players who are so-called past their peak, but still good enough for your squad. So just keep that type of thing in mind, but this is just a personal preference. The other thing I like to do is actually set the position. Normally people have it unnatural, which is fair enough because you don't want the player you're investing in to be as natural as possible, but I like to set it at competent. I think that normally gives you a decent base to build on, and more often than not you can retrain them in that position if need be, and sometimes they do have the attribute for it, they're just not comfortable for it. So like I mentioned, I like to have a mix of things. So let's say we're looking at a goalkeeper. I'll have the position set, of course. I also like to have the role, but I don't want to set it, let me set a different type of thing. Let's say midfielder, because those are probably the most varied roles. So midfielder on central. I don't like to have the role as is. I like to have it set on partially, because I feel like if they're just about okay with performing in it, they should still do a decent job. And so I have it set normally on partially. Let's say we're looking for an advanced playmaker. It's one of the most common midfielder roles in the game, and that's why it gives us a huge range of players here with 1,570. You can pick out of 1,570 players, so without a doubt you should be able to find one player at least. The next thing I like to do is actually pick out the attributes that are necessary for advanced playmakers. So let's say I'm looking for an advanced playmaker with attack duty. I'd set that 15 is a bit too high if you ask me. I like to set it on 12, like I mentioned, as the minimum. And then, of course, I like to give my players a bit of leeway, because not everyone's going to have a complete, 12 attribute for every single thing. So I think if they're lacking in about 3 attributes of the required role, they should be okay. So I set it down to about 10, let's say, or if it's obviously 15 attributes, you set it at 12, and so on and so forth. Just three. You give them a leeway of 3 attributes where they're not meeting the minimum standard of 12. So this gives you a bit of a better base to work on. 700 down to 700 players. The next thing I like to do is go according to my scout's ability. So normally, the scout's judgment of ability and the scout's judgment of potential. And I like to have both. Well, actually, it depends on the type of player you're looking for. So I normally mention in my Let's Play modes that I like to have a balance of my squad, which is 2 players per position. 1 player who's ready for first team action, who is the top player in your squad, the first team option. Then I like to have a backup player who's normally a youngster who has a ton of potential. So it depends on what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for a youngster with potential, I'll have it set on ability, which is normally 2.5 stars and potential of 3 stars minimum. This normally means that they're ready for the Premier League and they have potential to become a leading player for the Premier League. But of course, always adjust your stars according to your actual squad. Your first teamer should normally be a 3-star minimum rating, and your backup should be 2.5 stars, like we mentioned. So let's say I'm looking for a first teamer. I'll set it on ability of 3 stars minimum, and this is the best way I judge my players. So now we're down to 19 players who are comfortable being an advanced playmaker. They've got the attributes for it, comfortable with the role itself, comfortable with being a midfielder, and they're under the age of 29 and have a minimum star rating of 3 stars. Now there still is a hint too many options in truth. It does give you a wide variety of options of players that maybe you can buy on cheap who are still good. Let's say Lucas Romero, for example. He's considered a good player for most Premier League sides, but if I'm looking for a top choice, then 3 stars won't cut it. So I could actually go and raise the star rating to about 3.5, and that will cut it down to 4 players. And this seems like a more likely better judge of ability, where we've got the likes of Ozil, Nzonzi, Arthur, and Zielinski. Zielinski is a leading player for most Premier League sides. So this is the type of player that you're looking for. We've got also Arthur, of course, and Nzonzi's leading, and Ozil you can assume is a star player. But my scout says he's leading. So let's say we've got these 4. Who do we want to invest in? Your scout's already telling you the minimum or maximum price range. Sometimes if a player doesn't have it set there, you can actually inquire and try and get that player to come to your squad for a cheaper price, of course. But here all 4 players are comfortable with moving to Manchester United, and they also have a general range of how much you're going to spend on them. So this is kind of the ideal situation where you've got it. So you can go for Mesut Ozil, for example, sign him for free, or even try and invest in him right now. But this is how I try and find the best players available to me, and using my scouting, my scouts' ability in terms of their judgment, and the players that I'm trying to find. Now, of course, I haven't got everyone scouted first, so normally I would get rid of the judgment of ability. I'd get rid of them being comfortable with the role, and I just have the attributes and the position I'm looking for, and of course the age range that I'm looking for. And that way, it gives us 785 players. So some players who actually do want to move to Manchester United, and you would assume our top players weren't in that list because we haven't actually scouted them yet. So Toni Kroos, for example, he's unhappy at Madrid, worth 66 million. He's definitely a top player, but my scout just didn't show him because they haven't actually scouted for him. So normally in past FMs, you can actually just pretty much select down to about 500 players and ask your scouts to scout for them. But they've now declined they've decreased it to 50 players, so you do have to do it several times. But I pretty much just scout every player who I've never scouted before, who I don't actually have recommendations for, and just go on the basis of that. So another thing that comes up in mind with the new scouting system, let's say we're looking at advanced playmakers, let's go down to again 3 stars this time instead to give us a bit more options. You'll see that there is an actual recommendation. I still use the star system, but it's good to keep in mind your scouts' recommendations. 86 is obviously a high number. Anything in green really is a decent enough number, but it does go down. For example, we said we're looking for 3-star players, which are normally good, but my scout even though Aaron Moy shows up, my scout recommendation says he'd only be a useful signing, probably someone you don't want to invest in. This is a very fair judgment because Aaron Moy is a good player. He's not even 3 stars in fact, so it's a bit weird that he's actually showed up here. But you would say my scouts recommendation, also you have to keep it in mind now. Try and avoid as much as possible these red, or even I guess you could say these are yellow. Try and stick to the greens as much as possible. Sometimes your scout recommendation is just on the basis that they're maybe a bit young. For example, Alex Iwobi is definitely a top signing to make in terms of long-term future, but right now your scout's trying to judge him on his current ability. He's probably thinking, Alex Iwobi is just a good player for most Premier League sides, and since we're a top team, he wouldn't actually be someone that we're looking to invest in. So despite his actual potential ability, your scout would recommend him just 64, not a high recommendation. So sometimes you do have to ignore it, and sometimes you do have to lean in its favor. So Iwobi actually represents a really top buy for a youngster with potential, 21 years of age, Nigerian international. He's got a resolute personality, which is a positive personality to have in your squad. Got the perfect attributes for an inside forward, and he's comfortable playing as an advanced playmaker like we mentioned, so he can very much do that role, and if necessary you can always retrain him to be a central midfielder, advanced playmaker. And obviously it's not the best case for Iwobi because he does have a decent amount of acceleration and pace. He's probably a bit better out wide, but just for the sake of argument, if you didn't have any options, Iwobi would very much so make a quality advanced playmaker if you needed him in your squad. So it's just some things to keep in mind. Let's say we're looking at Romero, no. Trying to find an example of a top player who's just a balanced personality. If you ask me, you do want to avoid these players. Let's have a look at this guy, Manu. Spirited is actually a top personality as well. We're not going to find anyone. And then he's fairly professional, that's good. Normally top players are actually, have positive personalities, and that's exactly why they are top players. Looks like we actually can't find anyone, so this is actually a good bunch of players to try and invest in. So all depends obviously on the type of general personality you want your squad to have. Do you want them to be, obviously you can, as long as they have positive personalities in general, that's a good thing, but sometimes managers like to have a squad of only fairly determined personalities, so that the whole squad is determined. Sometimes they like to have ambitious personalities. So here's an example. Zielinski, we mentioned that he's highly recommended by the scout. He's a top player, leading player for most Premier League sides, a good investment in your squad in general, but he's even either-footed, but his personality is balanced, so you do kind of risk it when you do invest in him. Let's say your team goes down, if he doesn't have a determined personalities during a match, so if you're 1-0 down, he doesn't have a determined personality, he might not respond to going down 1-0 too well as much as his teammates would be, who are more determined, for example, and so he won't be necessarily helping his teammates. But at the same time, keep in mind when you go for a balanced player, for example, sometimes your squad's personality rubs off on him, and he does end up becoming a more ambitious personality, for example, a more positive one. So it's just things to keep in mind, really. Every little thing helps when it comes to judging your players. But if you stick to the things that I told you, keeping an eye on your scouts' recommendation, keep an eye out on the old age system of, you know, using your scout's judgment of ability. Of course, your scout has to be someone that you need to trust as well. You go on competent for your position, you have the attributes with a little leeway, you have the role comfortable as well. It's pretty much set up for you investing in a player that should slot onto your side very easily. Of course, you should, in general, always give a signing 1 season's worth of adaptation, but when you use these many, you know, conditions when you're trying to buy a player, more often than not, they should slot into your team very easily, because you've kind of almost set them up to make it impossible for them to fail, you know, with all the conditions that you've added to them. So I think in general that kind of covers it. Obviously for smaller clubs, or, you know, clubs in lower divisions, you do want to lower this attribute, because if you set it at 12, you'll never be able to find anyone with 12 attributes. If you're in League 2, for example, it's going to be very difficult. So if you ask me for Skybet League 2, I normally lower it to about 8. I don't like anything less than 8, and I try and avoid anything at 8 as well, to be honest. And the more you know, the higher up you climb up in the leagues and the divisions and whatnot, you can start to eventually build up to 12. In general, like I mentioned, we did set this at 12, let's say, but the likes of Özil shows up, whose attributes are very much comfortable with being top attributes. 19, we're looking for advanced playmaker, and he's covered all of them. We're looking for an advanced playmaker on attack, so he's got 14, 13 for pace and acceleration, dribbling 17, 19 passing, technique, vision, teamwork. He's a top advanced playmaker in truth. Fairly professional personality as well, and his player traits are quite comfortable with the advanced playmaker role. So that's just the general things that you should be looking for when you're looking to buy the best players available to your club, and not the best players in the world. And that's the kind of difference that I'm trying to you know, make clear when you're trying to invest in a player. Now, another thing to keep in mind, I feel like some people always are looking to invest in some players, but let's say, you know, I like to remove actually my own players being excluded from the search. So I'm looking for a top you know, advanced playmaker in central midfield with the attributes. I've removed Manchester United from being excluded, so they should show up on our screen now. If Manchester United do have any top advanced playmakers, they should show up on the screen, and there you go. It won't actually show the recommendation, because of course they're currently at your club, but this is also another good way to judge whether a player, when you're trying to fit him into tactic, do you think, let's see, is Lingard a good enough advanced playmaker? If you put in all the things that I told you, you know, the conditions to search for, then it would show that Lingard, if you did play him, even though he's most naturally an inside forward, if you did play him as an advanced playmaker, he'd be very comfortable with the role. And of course, he's comfortable with a number of different roles. Lingard in general is very versatile, but it just shows you that if you did want to play him as an advanced playmaker, you could very much get away with it. And Rashford as well, Mkhitaryan, Herrera, Mata. Of course, there's more natural players, but you know, let's say if you found too many options. Let's say you ended up with 100 players found, and you think, okay, there's too many options, I want to reduce it even further. You can definitely go for is comfortable with the role 100%, that reduces it already, and you can also go with is natural, and that way you have the perfect options available to you. So it's, you know, it's always an option. I just try and give myself as much leeway as possible to try and find players who are comfortable with the role. But yeah, you know, you could do it with your own players, and that way you can see, let's say you've got too many strikers and Rashford's in the team, but you're like, oh, I don't have any space for Rashford, maybe I can try and squeeze him in as an advanced playmaker. Then this attribute would clearly tell you he can actually play as an advanced playmaker if necessary. So, you know, it's just another thing to keep in mind, and you can use it to judge your own players as well. The same thing really goes for loans. Of course, loans are much more difficult, but that's a different story entirely, and I feel like this is the best way to find players for your squad. Now, just bear in mind, you don't even have the conditions of, for example, trying to find players who are their contracts have expired, or players who are transfer listed. They'll all show up here. So if you did want to add conditions, you know, of saying, I'm looking for transfer listed players only, you can do that. Another thing that I like to do during the game, which sometimes helps out, and it's not normally for top clubs, it's normally for smaller clubs, obviously to keep the contract status unexpired and see if there's anyone available, but at the same time, look for advanced contracts that are going to expire in 6 months, so you can actually go ahead and sign them for free and wait for them to come in summer, for example. Of course, right now we're still in the early, so you'd actually have to look for someone who's expiring in a year. So Mesut Ozil shows up, and he's someone that you can shortlist for a while, wait until it's after the January transfer window, and sign him for free. But yeah, those are just as much as possible things to keep in mind. Everyone has got their own personal preferences of how they search for players, but I feel like this is the best way to find the best players for your club. And at the same time, you should be able to adjust to your squad very comfortably. You don't want to just, for example, go for players who don't have any of the attributes of an advanced playmaker, for example, and they're not even comfortable with advanced playmaker. You're just looking for midfielder, central midfielder with the top ability, for example, and you buy someone like William Carvalho. Probably he's a deep line playmaker. You try and squeeze him in as advanced playmaker in central midfield, but he's clearly not comfortable with the role. As advanced playmaker, he has no flair, which is something you don't want to look for. You set him on attack, he doesn't have any acceleration or pace. These are the type of things that you do want to keep in mind. And so setting it at these things is probably best. Another thing that you can actually do in terms of personality, if you did want to add the condition, you can actually search for personality, so you don't have to go through each player individually. You can go in general, personality, set it at not balanced, and that way you don't find anyone who's sort of neutral. You might find players who have negative personalities, like temperamental or unambitious, those type of things, but more often than not, you'd actually find positive players, positive personality players, and just going through these couple of examples, you can see that everyone's got a good personality, a positive one that should help your squad. But yeah, it's all just things to keep in mind. You can definitely look online as well for positive player personalities. You can look online for the list of best players to buy for your squad, bargains and all that. But I just feel like this is a better way of doing things. Scouting, which is a huge part of the game, and a lot of fun, of course, with the game, when playing the game, of course, as well. So I think that's all for today's episode. If you did enjoy it, then of course, please hit the like button and subscribe for more Daily Football Manager 2018 content. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Tell me if I'm wrong, tell me if I'm right, tell me how you search for players. I want to hear it all. Again, guys, as always, thank you all very, very much for watching.